Assalamu alaikum. All right. If I can get everybody's attention, we're just going to start on the second panel. It's called Thinking Gender, Theorizing Sexualities. And we've got 4 dynamic papers, and I'm really looking forward to the presentations and the discussions to follow. If I can begin with just introducing you guys to our speakers and our panelists today. Bilan Hashi holds a bachelor's degree of arts from the University of Toronto in the area of anthropology, linguistics, and women and gender studies. She also holds an MA in gender studies at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario, Canada. Her research interests include gendered subjectivity, Somali poetics, and cultural and affective geographies. These themes haunt her creative work as well, particularly in her poetry and short stories. Muna Udbi Abdul Qadir, just known as Udbi, is a PhD student in curriculum studies and teacher development with a specialization in comparative international and development education at the University of Toronto at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education. Her dissertation research focuses on Canadian militarism and imperialism within the Somali territories. Hodan Ahmed completed her Master's in Arts in Leadership, Adult Education, and Community Development, again at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education at the University of Toronto. Hodan Ahmed is a diaspora Somali Canadian researcher with a focus on community engagement, public policy, racialized poverty, employment, and youth advocacy. She has over 8 years of international field work, interviewing experience from her former professional work as a mind risk educator with South Sudanese refugees and with Somaliland primary girl education programs. Her work as a community organizer and youth advocate working with underserved and underemployed Black youth in Toronto has allowed her to draft projects and community implementation policies. Quite the expert. She has over 10 years of professional experience in the fields of community development, facilitation, governance, leadership, and youth advocacy. Aurelia Warsamet is a Somali independent scholar that lives in Canada, Alberta, I think we spoke. She has a master's degree in sociology from the University of Bologna and a master's degree in education from the University of Alberta. She is a member of the Canadian Association of African Studies, and her research areas include postcolonialism, qualitative research methodologies, politics and gender, and higher education in Somalia. Aurelia will be giving the first presentation. Her paper is titled Graceful Femininity versus Patriarchal Domination, Understanding the Role of Somali Women in Pastoral Communities.
Good morning, everybody. Jum'ah Mubarak. My name is Aurelia Warsamet, as already been said. I'm honored to be here today, and I'm going to talk about the role of women in our society, and I will start by explaining what brought me to write this paper, because I'm interested in the notion of identity, the fluid identity of Somali women, particularly those in pastoral communities, because as it has been said before, the concept of the identity of Somali has different variations, and pastoral identity is one of them. And that shows the richness and the diversity of our country, How I came about to write this paper was I was a director of project coordinator for a program that basically provided scholarship for Somali women. And during that period of my life that I have coordinated that project, I interviewed several girls in the northern Somalia, from Puntland to Somaliland, all the way to like the middle of Somalia. And intention was to find pastoral women, young women who would go to higher education, and interviewing these women allowed me to really understand the vibrancy and the drive that was pushing these girls to wanting to achieve education. And I was interested, they were very fierce and very smart, and that is what I was able to observe in their identity, that the message they had and what they were transmitting to me were the same ideals and the same notion as a woman, a Somali woman, that I had carried throughout my life. And I wanted to compare and analyze what the similarities between their ways of thinking, because the thing with this project was they had to write essays and tell us why they wanted to study and pursue an education. And so the ideals that these women had and their strength is the same message that was transmitted to me from my great-grandmother and my grandmother and my whole family. Like the main women of my family gave me that baggage of culture and identity that I carried with me. And it was really interesting to see that after 20 years as a diasporic woman, detached from my reality, from my childhood, from what I grew up with, I reconnected with these girls. And that is essentially the reason what that pushed me to write this paper. And I also think that those ideas and those messages that were given to me, we can regard that as a really flexible, dynamic form of narrative that constitutes the identity of each and every single woman. And so I just wanted to start by describing it as wisdom pearls, which are little wisdom pearls that were given to me on a daily basis, based on the interactions that I had with the major female figures of my childhood, and the women that I encounter every day. And those, put them all together, they constitute who I am today. And so I was always fascinated by the sense of pride that, for example, my grandmother had, and through her composure and how she talked to people, and that's something that I always emulated as a child. She always showed a strong sense of fierce womanhood in challenging all kinds of hardships, and at the same time holding together her family in a tight grip. And this was something that I always looked up to. Somali women have always been the driving force of our society, and they control the primary modes of production, be it social, economic, political, or otherwise. So, for instance, the role of appeasement between clans and how marriage contracts between sub-clans were conducted was a crucial element as far as creating harmonious, peaceful negotiations for peace and peace among communities, different communities in Somalia. After all, the environment, our environment has always been a harsh environment with scarcity of water, but the role of women made it more livable, and society was, as a result, more harmonious, because the role they played was very crucial in that context. So women have always been well versed in poetic duels as they engage in the practice of Qaylodan, of denouncing any wrongdoings by the traditional patriarchal order. As the saying goes, the mer iyo dumarba abaar baa looga baxaa, which literally means that women and donkeys guarantee the survival and drought in drought times. So it's important to get a thorough understanding of pre-colonial gender differentiation and the role of women to fully comprehend the important role Somali women have and have had in their communities. Therefore, this is in contrast to what I have read about colonial depiction of women, which is completely in contrast of what Somali women's role in society is. Colonial hierarchies and colonialism, it was a political and economic project whose objective was to categorize our culture and social practices. It follows a binary code of us versus them, a code that follows the Hegelian dialectics, which has already been referred to yesterday and today, between the master and the servant. So when the colonialism, one must reflect the deep ways in which colonialism constructs the basis of gender and differentiation, and how after many years it gets picked up, and how these legacies carry on and creating a sort of a hegemonic content. Therefore, colonial scholarship never cared to understand the intricate composition of Somali pastoral society, for example, and the fundamental role that women played at its core. The majority of colonial studies on Somali society have always been supported by hierarchical categories that marginalized and did not take into account colonial subjects, especially women, because the sort of patriarchal order that was constituted by colonialism was itself a rigid structure that was predefined, whereas the Somali patriarchal structure is a fluid and dynamic one, and women at its and inside this structure they move freely, and they have a very much flexible role in it that's not predefined. I mean, it is predefined because each society has gender differences, but women are at the same. Women and men do not have many differences. The chilling descriptive narrative of early explorers such as Richard Burton, Arthur Rimbaud, or even Rebecca Brichetti, and I. M. Lewis in the 50s do not render justice to the real nature of Somali society. Especially Somali women were legitimatized and misunderstood in their role, for they have been portrayed as being subjugated and held under the foot. And the intent of this paper is to just briefly describe or bring examples of the oral narrative, which is seen as a method of transmitting power and gender differences, and drawing on the pastoral histories through that were transmitted throughout the years. How through poems and historical narrative, the fundamental role Somali women fulfilled in their society was widely and is still widely acknowledged, in order to dismantle the negative connotations of the European Eurocentric colonial scholarship discourse, which, like I said, they led us to believe that we were subjugated, but we're not. Chant Monti talks about, in fact, an analysis of sexual difference in the form of cross-culturally singular monolithic notion of patriarchy leads to the construction of a reductive and homogeneous notion of the other. Therefore, colonization is a structural domination and suppression, focusing in specific modes of appropriation and knowledge codification. In that instance, like I mentioned, some European explorers such as Rebecca Briquetti regarded Somalis having, and I quote, Somalis have all the virtues and awkwardness of primitive peoples. The savage instinct dominates on every thought. They steal anything they like. At the same time, the brute instinct of sexual pleasure does not restrain any types of violence. Or Richard Burton, on his famous book, The First Footsteps in East Africa, said that, I'm not even going to read the quote because it's very disturbing, but it just goes to show that the understanding that Europeans have of Somalis and that reality doesn't really, it doesn't even compare, because we have many examples that show, for example, the story of Hurio and Kabalov, about Hersi, whose pursuit of Hurio and his journey to make her his wife. Hersi was accompanied by his friend Kabalov, a poet who was an expert in gaining women's love. The story is about Hurio Ugas testing of Hersi's unraveling riddles to check his reliability as a husband. Hersi ultimately fails to meet Hurio's expectations, so she marries Kabalov, the eloquent and not so. So basically the story shows you that the women were sought after because they possessed a great deal of resilience, and a man without the role of a strong woman by his side would basically was not, like he would, the role he fulfilled in society was important for him to have a strong woman. Another important story about the another important story is this, the classical example within the patriarchal structure, how women demonstrated their infallible wit and power, and that's one of the reasons why I needed to bring up this the story of Hurio and Kabalov. Another example is the story behind Al-Layl Dumay, A Night Has Fallen, which is one of the other main poems in Somali history, which traces actually the strong disappointment of Rago Ugas in failing to secure the girl he wanted to marry, and underlying the difficulties he had encountered and the challenges this lady that he was pursuing put him through. She became somebody else's wife because there was a feud between these two individuals, and the woman they were fighting between they were actually fighting for this woman, and ultimately she went and married another person, but one of the pursuers lamented his defeat. A man whose heart aches cannot take a bride home. When the camels are thirsty, their outcries increase. Like a small girl whose mother now lives in the hereafter, whose father has brought another woman to sleep in the apple. I grieve constantly from the sorrow deep in my belly. I am the man whose fiancé has been given to another, which basically show you that men were dependent on women, and men had, there was the interaction between men and women, the way it was perceived by the Europeans was very much misunderstood, because being with a strong woman determined the being a strong and a successful individual in society. Another example that illustrates the important role of women in a society was there was a time that there was battles and for water and pastures, and a ruler with a great sense of ordinance and control summoned the elders one day in his community to bring, and he told them to bring a piece of meat that would symbolize what can divide or unite men folk as one. So most men brought different cuts of meat. A very poor man's daughter told her father to bring the throat of the goat, which is in Somali called hunguri, or which means greed. So the father felt very much embarrassed to bring such a such a poor piece of meat. So to the elders' assembly, as he put down the piece of meat in front of the king said, "Why did you bring that piece here today?" And the king and the father, fearing the king, said, "Sire, I apologize, but it was my daughter who told me to bring it." So the ruler said, "Your daughter is smarter than all these men," as she understood the riddle, which was that everyone tried to bring the most expensive or the most precious piece of meat, but she brought the hunguri, and that was in itself a great example of unification and appeasement among people. So it's interesting to note that while it's interesting to see that a small girl has challenged and has managed to actually bring this symbol of unification, and the elders have failed to achieve that. So in essence, understanding such stories of narrative in the traditional Somali society and the role that females fulfilled in that context is important to dismantle the negative connotations that Eurocentric colonial studies and scholarship discourses lead us to believe that women were not relevant in their society, just like they did in other communities, in, for example, the native communities in Canada or in the United States. So women were believed to be undermined and forced into an objectified and subjugating role, and that is actually not the case, because as a Somali woman, I feel I have inherited a lot of wisdom and a lot of survival elements that allowed me to be here today, and also the fact that every positive initiatives, for example, in the Somali studies today, women are the biggest initiators of such undertakings, if you will. And I find that it's important and paramount that we look back at our history and trace the elements and the traditional stories that were given to us by our foremothers and bring it to the table, because understanding those concepts, we can regain and reconquer the spaces that we're going to exercise our identity and our power, and to make a society a better one, and to move forward. And where are we headed as a Somali, as a people, as women? And that's what my paper is about.
Our next presenter is Bilam Hashi, and her paper is titled Negotiating Female Modesty and Sexual Desire in Gabad Hishabna.
Hello, everybody. So the position of my paper is twofold. The first one is that, as we've talked about today and yesterday, that the perils of the single narrative and how to unpack that. And the second is including notions of femininity and sexuality in just the discourse about Somali studies. Okay, so the dominant discourse of Somali womanhood, what I refer to as Gabar Hishodle, perpetuates an ideal where modesty and the absence of sexual desire is considered the epitome of Somali femininity. I also argue it lays the conditions for belonging, whether through performance-based, affectively, or performatively, within the Somali social imaginary. In order to start thinking about the Gabar Hishodle ideal, I will begin with an exploration of the dominant discourse informing Somali womanhood. I then highlight the connection of female sexuality to modesty, a connection that is often silenced or hidden within the Gabar Hishodle narrative. And after I look at mixed discourses, and by mixed discourses, I mean discourses that use expressions of female sexual desire and modesty simultaneously, opening up a position that the dominant discourse is unable to name, and therefore I argue disrupting the process. While this is a conceptual paper, and as such, do not mention specific poets and poetry, the material I draw upon are different genres of Somali poetry and song. So Burambur, Helo, and Hes from the beginning of Somali nationalism until the 1990s. And if this is something that interests you, I'd be more than happy to discuss it individually afterwards. I'd like to also point out that this negotiation of modesty and sexual desire is also taken up in diasporic poets of Somali origin, such as Wassim Sharif, albeit in different ways. So various theorists such as Lidwin Captains and Anu Isatelo have taken up the dominant discourse surrounding Somali womanhood. In both works, the association of Somali femininity with unsalacious speech, demeanor, and actions is emphasized. Capitan in particular calls it moral womanhood and situates it in the years directly preceding the country's independence in 1960 to the decades after the formation of the Somali state. During this time, tensions arose between the anti-colonial and nationalist movements for independence. There were those who strove to stress the communal Somali identity, Somali Nimo, outside traditional and clan formations, and traditionalists who sought to retain Somali cultural authenticity as a means to distinguish the nation from Western forms of modernity. These two views also informed different approaches to Somali womanhood and femininity. The traditional rhetoric in particular was concerned with defining what a proper woman should be and upheld Somali femininity as Gabar Hishodle and situated it under the purview of the authority of a woman's family and clan. Captain states, invoking a traditional Somali femininity which sanctioned female morality in regards to, quote, women's behavior and dress in public space, and thus their sexuality and obedience or respect for authority, end quote, legitimates the gender discourse as authentic. The eminent authority of family and clan was expected to define and police women and girls' behaviors and actions in public and private spaces. These kinds of disciplinary practices are also prevalent in Anu Isatelo's research on diasporic Somali girls in Finland from the late 1990s to early 2000s. Looking at, quote, ideals and practices concerning gender, moral, and socio-spatial behavior, end quote, Isatelo claims that the expected physical location for a good girl was home with her family. She also notes that specific spaces, typically public and without family members, were deemed inappropriate and inviting perceived, quote, sexual and moral indecency, end quote. The connections between private spaces, public spaces, and the gauging of modesty is important in demonstrating the specific parameters and spaces Somali girls and women navigate in relation to their gender and sexual identities. Despite the differing time periods and geographies that these two theorists take up in their work, they draw attention to the ways that morality underpins an ideal Somali womanhood. They also pinpoint how this morality is rooted in tradition, and I mean the social constructed form of tradition, and justifies the rhetoric to label specific behaviors and actions as Western and therefore not authentically Somali. What they refer to morality, however, I designate as modesty, in particular within this concept of Gabar Hishadle, as Hishad denotes a particular type of modesty. So my thoughts on the dominant discourse of Somali womanhood is through the concept of Gabar Hishadle, which is a vernacular phrase loosely translated as a modest girl. It is an idealized gender describing Somali femininity. The word Gabar contained within the phrase Gabar Hishadle means maiden in English. Therefore, regardless of the age of the girl or woman, if she is of a marriageable age but not married, she would be considered a Gabar. Hishad in Somali is defined as modesty, and by modesty I mean cultural, social, and religious norms dictating decency or propriety. In this context, then, modesty is also gendered and an indicator of an ideal femininity. These themes can be thought of in relation to the ways that modesty in connection with sexuality and hishad emerges in Arabic lexical history, specifically the term hishma. Laila Abu Lagud claims that hishma is, quote, formed from the trilateral root hashima and is translated by a cluster of words including modesty, shame, and shyness. In its broadest sense, it means propriety, end quote. Gideon Kressel also reveals that hishma and other words with the same root, such as hashem and hishmiya, have sexual modesty defined at their core. So akin to hishma, hishad is a gender index of sexual modesty. And hishad has an equivalent meaning to its Arabic counterpart according to Heather Marie Aku, and this is a measure of respectability in the Somali community. I take that corresponding word to be hishma, not only the denotative meaning, for its denotative meaning, but also for the connotative association between both words. I also think that there could be a further association made between these two words, hishma and hishad, as they share the initial syllable with its voiceless pharyngeal fricative, and this is common to Semitic, Cushitic, and Berber branches of the Afro-Asiatic family tree. So for this reason, perhaps it could be that there could be linguistic cognates and not an Arabic loanword. So modesty then is a gendered expectation and standard emerging from the cultural ideologies and constructing Somali femininity through discourses of respectability. With this in mind, I suggest that certain gendered behaviors, acts, and silences dictate the sociality of Gabar Hishadle. These codes or signs also legitimate Gabar Hishadle as disassociated with female sexual desire and agency, something that I argue poets and singers who use the mixed discourses unsettle. The discourse of Gabar Hishadle as well uncovers the link between contained sexual female sexuality, and the parameters of a premarital female experience and subjectivity, especially as it pertains in the negation of female desire and agency. So at the core of the dominant discourse, then there's this inverse association between modesty and unbounded sexuality. And by unbounded sexuality, I mean sexuality outside the confines of and not leading up to marriage. And this point is particularly germane as I consider marriage a code of hishad, one that sanctifies the expression of female sexual desire. As hishad signaled gender propriety, which I associate with the marital state, female sexual desire was considered antithetical in nature. This adamant distancing of sexual desire outside the confines of marriage then becomes engulfed into the Gabar Hishoda narrative. As a result, any utterance of female sexual desire, and by that I mean overt expressions in female Somali poetry and songs, were bracketed outside the Gabar Hishoda paradigm. And while these discourses, or rather counter-discourses, are relevant and important, what I'm more interested in is the mixed discourse that simultaneously contains female sexual desire as well as references of Hishod in Somali female poetry. And what do I mean by this? So Hishod manifests itself externally through certain behaviors, actions, dress, and speech acts. And these expressions are contained within specific motifs, for example, marriage and other religiously and culturally sanctified customs and traditions. This is what I refer to as codes of Hishod. By signifying Hishod, these codes not only indicate the speech act of a modest female, but also indexes the semiotic position within the Gabar Hishod discourse, as it is a recognizable sign to the Somali collectivity. So codes of Hishod, indexical of sexual modesty, indirectly allow the expression of female sexual desire through a hidden message, a sarbeh, where certain members, whether other poets or spectators, understand the message where the general public does not. In other words, Somali female poets use these codes of Hishod, I argue, as a medium to publicly engage with stalwart preconceptions of female sexuality and Somali womanhood. And I think that the advantage of using these codes is that because they are recognizable, they are read through a particular lens that deems them ineffectual to the dominant discourse. However, the subtext reveals alternative narratives, one that not only conjures the Somali womanhood through social relationality, but because of it, opens up other possibilities. So, put it slightly different, there's a recoding of codes, one that pushes for the expression of female sexual desire through Hishod. As such, the validation of the dominant discourse of Gabar Hishod allows an adjunctive position that is contained and at the same time runs counter to the discourse. Miyako Inoue calls this position the middle in her research of women's language and Japanese femininity. Looking at the speech of her interlocutor Yoshida-san, she claims, quote, "This elusiveness accounts for the fact that Yoshida-san speaks from a position that the discourse fails to name. She does not use women's language in an overt sense, yet she does not speak against women's language or outside its regimes either. Her strategy and the semiotic position that it creates as the middle ambiguously circumvents all possible positions and names that the discourse designates as external, oppositional, or deviant," end quote. In a similar light, the dominant discourse of Gabar Hishod fails to name women who use Hishod of sexual desire, revealing the lacunae of dominant discourses, the complex and unstable processes that underpin it. And I think that it is a space that we can think of ways that we can talk about sexuality, gender in a different way. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Hilvan Mohammed, and her paper is titled First Generation Somali Canadian Women Activism in a Neoliberal Multicultural State.
So my research built on what Dylan said and what Biff and Ariella said, in a sense of looking at the activism and advocacy of Somali women. And activism is not something unique to the Somali community. Somali women have always been engaged in different ways and different methods and models of activism within their own community and outside of their own community as well. So what I also wanted to do in my thesis was to do an intergenerational dialogue and to compare what we call the quiet activism of our mothers, the so-called Hishod activism, where they do a lot of the work without any kind of acknowledgement or recognition, and versus the younger generation, specifically my generation, the younger ones in their 20s, in their teens, and a lot of the vocal and very much visible, in-your-face activism that exists in Canadian society, in my community, definitely in Toronto. So my thesis, to put it in a more formal way, focuses on how Somali women activists perform social justice work in their everyday life. Specifically, I examine how the lived experiences of Somali women activists enable, constrain, and socially organize the work they conduct in the Somali community and the larger Canadian society. Moreover, I analyze the everyday activism of 8 Somali women, specifically in Toronto, in order to learn the ways in which they mobilize, contest, and modify existing normative discourses and practices in their personal and professional life. So in essence, this study is about describing how Somali women activists in different spaces involve negotiating 2 sets of relations of accountability, namely formal accountability to hierarchical social relations in their professional settings and individual and community responsibility to anti-racism, feminism, and anti-Islamophobia and social justice principles in public life, and sometimes even in their own personal life. So those are some of the questions that were guided my research. So how has Somali women negotiated and challenged institutional racism and societal marginalization in a neoliberal multicultural state? And it was significant for me to really examine what does it mean to live in a multicultural state. Multiculturalism is a state project in Canada. And the Somali community, when they came to Canada, by and large, it was a time of economic recession. And it's a time where the economic principles of what we call the common economic principle between a partnership between government and the private sector was deteriorating due to the leadership that existed specifically in Ontario, which most of the Somali community was settling in. So I wanted to examine their lived experiences in the way in which they interacted with the state, the way in which they challenged oppressive tactics, and the way in which they fought for their legal recognitions and access to resources within the communities and in relation to the state. And the second question is, how has their activism informed both their lived experiences and perception of self as Black Muslim women in Canada? As we know, to be Black is very much a political recognition and a political identity. And for a lot of the Somali community, specifically our parent generation, to be Black was a shock to them, to be politically Black specifically. And what does that mean for them? Do they even consider themselves to be a Black Canadian or Black Muslim woman? And most of the women that I interviewed acknowledged their Blackness as well as their Muslim identity. Some of them are more aligned with their Black identity as opposed to their Islamic identity, and others were more Muslim first, Somali, and Black second. And the third question that guided my research was, what are the different sides of resistance from which first-generation Somali Canadian women perform within the Somali community and the larger society? So this is where I wanted to look at the intergenerational dialogue, the changes in terms of the activism. So the activism of our parents and how that activism shifted and changed with the younger generation. So my theoretical consideration was Black feminism and critical race theory. And as we know that Black feminism is crucial to really unpacking what it means to be politically Black, and specifically the interlocking system of being Black woman and Muslim woman, to be gay or straight, lesbian, to be trans. So the interlocking system that Kimberly Crenshaw identified as what she called the intersectionality of identities and in the way in which we interact everyday life as Black bodies in public spaces. So Black women have always highlighted the ways that social categories intersect with lived experiences, in this case race, gender, class, sexual orientation, including ethnicity, nationality, formulate a system of oppression where individuals embody them and carry it as they encounter the world every day. So social theories, as feminist scholars, specifically Black feminist scholars, have always looked at what activism means to Canadian women, specifically in my case, how has lived experiences of racialized women, in this case Black Somali women, both formal and informal settings, defines and somehow describes the multiple identities and experiences in which they explore in their everyday life. So the activism of Black women in North America, specifically in Canada, then strive to make the political personal and the personal political, since the struggle against racial, sexual, heteronormative practices and class oppression impacts and shapes both the public and private spheres. So the activism of Black women is primarily focused on creating this space, thought process and intellectual discourse, connecting generations in dialogue about theories of social change and histories of activism. The critical race theory, and I think the earlier panel really touched on what racial distinction and racialization means when it comes to knowledge production. So racial distinctions is constituted in the way that we think, the way that we formulate policies, implement the law. In turn, it reproduces racial hierarchies. In fact, race is part and parcel of Western modernity, which creates an environment where race permeates our way of life and knowledge production. So as we know, European colonialism and imperialism have historically categorized human society on the basis of biological features into certain hierarchies where race becomes the basis of various forms of discrimination to this day. So race and racism is very much embedded in the law, in everyday life, when we encounter the state, when we go to school, when we go to work, even in our homes. So consequently, race becomes the most organizing form of category of social understanding in Canada. And it's maintained simultaneously through interaction between government agencies and minority groups seeking social change, which employs race as central analytical category for understanding our society and its racial and social formation. Omi and Renan call that the theory of racial formation in Canada, which consequently introduces and affirms the same racial hierarchy the state and society claims to have overcome with multiculturalism and diversity. So racial knowledge then is about establishing hierarchies of distinctions and categories that constrain how we think about race and racialization. So for instance, the language used when describing the Somali community in the 1990s is often at a crossroad between what we call Orientalism and Africanism. So how and I, when we used to take the course with Shirin Razak, we talked about what does it mean, like the Somali identity, you're not African enough, or neither are you Arab, right? So there's intersection of Orientalism and Africanism. So Orientalism is an ontological and epistemological distinction between the Orient, i.e. the Muslim, and the Occident, the West. So the West is always the subject, and the Muslim is always the object. So the Orient is an integral part of European material civilization and culture, where accepting the basis differences between the two is the starting point from which white society establishes theories, epics, literature, social descriptions, and political account concerning the Orient, its people, customs, minds, and destinies. On the other hand, Africanism is about the materiality of Africa, its history, language, people, and culture, which has been racially constructed by white supremacy since the Atlantic slave trade and Western colonialism in Africa. Thus, Western hegemony controlled the production of knowledge and processes of validation and affirmation in North America. And so when we talked about orality and oral history, it's very much embedded in that. So accordingly, this community of experts, which predominantly are white men, has the power to define and give credibility to other forms of knowing, where marginalized people of color consistently encounter major obstacles in the advancement of their own knowledge, of their own history, of their own orality. I'm not going to go through that. This is just a literature review that I did. So in order for me to really, look at Somali woman activism, Somali community is a contemporary black community in North America. I have to look at black women and the civil rights era, the black woman activism in Canada, and so that is what it is. Well, let's go to the next one. So I'm just going to quickly touch on my findings. So methodology, I use life history narrative. We can all Google that. So let's go to the next slide. So these are the 8 Somali women, and I gave them all cities and regions of Somalia for anonymity reason. So Abgoya was 60 years old. She had a master's in agriculture. Her background in activism is in education, family, criminal justice system. Bosaso was 57 years old, master's of finance, Somali family and Somali youth is predominantly a lot of her activism is focused on. And Bur'a is 48. She has a Bachelor of Economics, but a lot of the work that she does is within the Somali community in relation within the black community and the Muslim community. And she does a lot of Islamophobia and education and issues within Toronto and the Peel region specifically. Baidabo is 45. She has a Master's of Finance, Social Work. She does a lot of the mental health and family court. Barbara is master's in social justice and mental health. So that's what her activism is focused on, her GESA. So the last three are more of the younger generations, and a lot of them deals with issues of, through social media, challenging gender normative practices, challenging what it means to be in a Hisholle, challenging what it means to be a Somali Muslim woman. So those are some of the findings and activism by default. So a lot of the questions surrounded about how did they come about to their activism? And many of them said that they came to their activism by accident. Many of them didn't really plan to be an activist. The only reason that they were activists is because there was tremendous need in the communities, and so they had to get involved and engage with issues that pertain to the need and concerns of the Somali community. So systematic racism, community need, a lot of them said community need, specifically the older generation said that they had to do something. They just couldn't, they didn't want their family to be the only successful story in the Somali community. And societal marginalization was also a big issue. So this is one of the quotes from the youngest person that I interviewed. She said that my Somali identity and I was other all the time. I had a situation where what teachers would call me nigger. I didn't even know what that word meant. Like I didn't know what that meant, so I went home and I asked my mom and I said, what does nigger mean? And my mom didn't even know there was that language barrier. Like I didn't master English until I was 10 years old. So for a while, I genuinely thought nigger was an endearment, because teachers would say that as if it's normal things to say. And I thought it was normal until now that I think about it. And that is really tremendously violent experience for her. And we can skip those, and then we can go to the next category. Yeah, so societal marginalization, a lot of the Somali women in their 50s and 60s, and including 40s, talked about the fact that when they came to Canada, and there was an assumption that they were new, this idea that you're a new immigrant, as if though every experience, every education, your professional life, the previously before you came to Canada was nothing, as if though it was erased. That devaluing their skills, their education, their lived experiences, and how does that impact their materiality, the material cost for the Somali community, and the fact that they live in poverty. It's because the inability for a lot of the Somali professionals to use their credential, to use their education, to be able to rent and in the private market. Hence why a lot of the Somali community fought to have access to the TDSP, or what I call the Toronto Community Housing, TCHC. So the second finding was really looking at redefining diaspora Somali identity. So many of them, especially the younger generation, wanted to contest cultural norms. They wanted to challenge a lot of taboo topics. One of my interviews is a social media activist and really addresses issues of sexual violence, and rape culture, and what does that mean to take really the silence and the taboo surrounding issues that is really killing people who are living with those issues. And as well as a tribal consciousness of being Black Muslim woman. So this one was a takeaway from W. Bois and what is the Black double consciousness of being Black in America. So what does that mean to be not just Black as a Somali person, but to also be Black Muslim woman? The multiple layers, specifically if you are a visible Muslim, there's the layers of that oppressive tactics that you experience in the public. And reformulating Canadianism as well. We can go to the next. Yeah. So one of them I interviewed said, not only do Black lives matter for us, but our womanhood matter to us. So does us being Muslim matter. Some of us don't have the luxury to separate ourselves and just call ourselves Muslim. That's why intersectionality is so important. So we're always challenging and debating our humanity. Particularly as an East African, my Blackness is always debatable. Like people are always challenging me. I'm never Black enough. I don't know what other alternative, because I'm obviously Black. Because colorism strips the diversity of Blackness. And also the other one touches on what it means to be politically Black. I'm done.
Thank you for that. Our final speaker is Muna Udbi Abdulqadir Ali, otherwise known as Udbi, and her paper is titled Outing Gay Imperialism, Unmapping Lesbian, Bisexual, and Gay Human Rights Discourse.
So I switched the title of my paper to say Unmapping Gay Imperialism, a Postcolonial Approach to Lesbian and Gay Human Rights Discourse. So the project of mapping has played a significant role in the colonization of land and people, and McClintock argues that the knowledge constituted by the map both preceded and legitimized the conquest of land. She describes the map as a technology of knowing that claims to capture the truth about a place in scientific form. As such, the project of mapping is a technology of possession, promising those who have the capacity to make such perfect representation must also have the rights of territorial control. And we can see when we talk about Africa, the most infamous map is this map that came out of the Berlin meeting of 1884. And in this meeting, the colonial powers of Europe met in Berlin to carve out the borders of the entire continent of Africa. Africa was cut into pieces based on the European states that colonized it. This project of mapping continues well over 100 years after the Berlin meeting. This map right here is a map produced by ILGA, which is the International Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Trans, and Intersex Association, but just shortly known as ILGA. On May 13th of last year, ILGA released its 10th edition of its annual report entitled State-Sponsored Homophobia, a world survey of laws, criminalization, protection, and recognition of same-sex love. As the title suggests, the report is an examination of every nation state's laws and regulations on lesbian and gay identified people. So for the past 10 years, ILGA has produced a report and map of the world that divides the world based on lesbian and gay rights. ILGA's mapping of the world classifies and color codes nation states and regions based on 3 categories: protection, recognition, and persecution of lesbian and gay identified people, as you can see from this map. The states that persecute lesbian and gay people are colored in shades of red, yellow, and orange, and these states are primarily in the Caribbean, Middle East, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and Africa. The Somali territories, and just to quickly state as a footnote, I use the term Somali territories, like many of us in this room have talked about in our works, to point to the ways in which Somalia, this idea of Somalia as a unified nation is, and its borders are socially and historically produced by Europe and remains a site of contested borders and border making. And this is a project I've taken in some of my other published work on state formation and statehood. So the Somali territories are mapped out by ILGA in 2 shades of red, representing the persecution of lesbian and gay people. In this paper, I examined the 2015 ILGA report to unpack the imperial impulses and racism ingrained within discourses of homophobia and anti-homophobia, as well as lesbian and human rights discourses. With a specific focus on the Somali territories, I explore the workings of gay imperialism, which is basically an imperialist project framed as development and humanitarianism led by LGBT movements here in the West. So I explore the workings of this form of imperialism, which is also known as pink colonialism or homo-imperialism. Specifically, I'm looking at how are Somali territories and Somali people constructed within these discourses of homophobia and anti-homophobia. How are development discourses used to universalize Western epistemologies on sexualities and silence others? And what happens to sexually fluid people whose sexualities do not fall under the confines of lesbian and gay identity categories or heterosexual and homosexual binaries? And where do these homophobic laws come from? So in this paper, I argue that ILGA's report and map is part of a broader project of imperialism masked under cloaks of development and anti-homophobia activism. I focus in on ILGA's work on the Somali territories to further illuminate the workings of gay imperialism in states considered homophobic. So in ILGA's examination of Africa, they highlight that same-sex sexual practices are illegal in 34 states within Africa, and the Somali territories being one of them. Within the report, they do an overview of section Article 409 of the Somali Penal Code, which states, "Whoever has carnal intercourse with a person of the same sex shall be punished where the act does not constitute a more serious crime, the imprisonment from 3 months to 3 years, where the act committed is an act of lust different from carnal intercourse, the punishment imposed shall be reduced by 1/3. The law on homosexuality in the Somali territories has roots in the colonial history. After the 1960 union of parts of British Somaliland and Italian Somaliland, the Somali Penal Code was established. The Penal Code replaced the Italian Penal Code of 1930 and the Indian Penal Code of 1860, which applied to British Somaliland. The Somali Penal Code was largely influenced by these two colonial codes from the colonizer. The Indian Penal Code of 1860 was originally formed in India. However, the code was adopted to other British colonies during the colonial era. The Indian Penal Code of 1860 classifies homosexuality as an unnatural offense, and Section 377 states, whoever voluntarily has carnal intercourse against the order of nature with any man, woman, or animal shall be punished with imprisonment for life, or with imprisonment of either description for term, which may extend to 10 years, and shall also be liable to fine. It's important to note that Section 377 remains in the constitution of many former British colonies, including India, Indonesia, and the list goes on. And it is no coincidence that Article 409 of the Somali Penal Code is worded so similarly to the British law. Article 409 of the Somali Penal Code reflects and is influenced by the Indian Penal Code. However, this is neglected in ILGA's case study of the Somali territories. Article 409 is seen as a law created by Somali people without any influence of colonization. And just to get back to that map to help. Yeah. So within ILGA's mapping of the world, the Somali territories are understood as a homophobic nation state that actively persecutes lesbian and gay identified people. Britain and Italy, on the other hand, are seen as gay-friendly and anti-homophobic and colored in shades of green, the recognition states. The report neglects any discussion as to how and who has influenced the Somali Penal Code. Instead, the Somali territories are shamed and labeled as homophobic without any historical context given. It is important to think about when you're reading through ILGA's work and their report, what does ILGA gain from neglecting the colonial origins and historical context of Article 409? And what is the purpose of providing an overview of laws regarding lesbian and gay issues? And what is missed in this overview? What does ILGA's report, what kind of work does that do in this world? And who benefits from that? So, as previously stated, the project of mapping has been significant to the colonial project. Those who create the map become the expert on the territory and have a form of ownership to the land. And the map represented by ILGA is claiming a certain level of ownership over those states constructed as homophobic. The map is the colonizer's way of negotiating. Mapping out the world in the map is the colonizer's way of negotiating a world filled with terrifying ambiguities. Creating narratives of the people and land is both a method of control and domination, as well as a way for the Western subject to know itself. ILGA's map, along with the report, follows this Orientalist logic of polarizing the world based on states considered anti-homophobic, progressive against those that are the homophobic and backwards. And this goes into questions and discussions around temporality. And I think Johann Fabian says it best in his work on anthropology, and he argues that anthropology works to construct relations with its other by the use of temporal devices, which imply affirmation of difference as distance. Fabian's analysis of anthropology can be used to understand the workings of international development, and specifically ILGA's work. Within ILGA's work, temporal distancing is used to differentiate the West and Western lesbian and gay subjects from the East and its other. The West and its people are constructed as enlightened, modern, and progressive, thus setting the Somali territories and Somali people as operating in a temporal space behind that of the West. Fabian calls this the denial of covalence. And this is inherent within all development work. Even the language of developed and development, developed and developing insinuates that those that are developing must catch up in order to inhabit the same temporal space of those that are developed. So ILGA's map of state-sponsored homophobia is thus a temporal device used to affirm difference as distance. So as previously mentioned, development initiatives have taken many forms in the last few decades, and we heard this yesterday when we talked about the women's movement and Western women's movements and the way in which it has used imperial impulse, it's used its development work, its imperial impulses, and now the same can be said with LGBT movements. We see, to paraphrase Gayatri Spivak, originally she said white men saving brown women from brown men, and then it changed into white women saving brown women from brown men, and now white queers saving brown queers from brown culture. So in the past, here in the West, lesbian and gay people were criminalized as promiscuous perverts and a threat to the heterosexual family of the Western state. However, in recent years, some LGBT subjects have been declared part of the Occidental tradition of feminism and gay friendliness. In Jasbir Puar's work on homonationalism, she argues that Western nation states produce narratives of exception through the war on terror, and as a result suspends heteronormative imagined communities to consolidate national sentiments and incorporate some homosexual subjects. Puar calls this homonationalism, the national inclusion of homosexuality and homosexual bodies. This kind of homosexuality operates as a regulatory script for normative gayness and homonormativity, and the racial and national norms that reinforce homonational and national subjects. Homonationalism is committed to global dominance of whiteness, deeply implicated and tied to the propagation of the United States Empire, as well as the Canadian Empire and all Western empires. In fact, Zeus Leonardo argues that in times of crisis, white dominance accommodates subjects previously marked as other in order to preserve its group power. And this is something we've seen throughout history, groups that were considered racialized moving into white, the category of white, whether it be the Irish, the Ashkenazi Jews, and Zeus Leonardo in his work actually talks about groups of East Asian now going into that process of whiteness, that process of racialization as well. And so in the case of homonationalism, white dominance brought some LGBT subjects into Western national imaginary and citizenry to further participate in neoliberalism and imperial projects framed as development initiatives. The extension of homonationalism from the nation state into international development is what becomes gay imperialism. So Joseph Massad calls the homonational subject embarking in international development the gay international. So the gay international wants to produce a world in its own image wherein its sexual categories and desires are safe from being questioned. ILGA is made up of the gay international subject working to save the third world, sexually variant and gender fluid bodies from themselves and their culture. By representing and defending gays and lesbians, the Gay International gets into the old boys club of mainstream politics. Using human rights discourses and discourses of homophobia and anti-homophobia, the Gay International and ILGA legitimizes and justifies their work. So lesbian and gay rights discourse is coupled with notions of civilized and uncivilized. In other words, lesbian and gay rights have become markers of modernity. They have become the yardstick to measure democracy and progress. So I touch on who makes up ILGA and how gay imperialism came to be and what is gained by constructing the Somali territories and Somali people as homophobic. Now I want to bring us back into the ILGA report and the Somali territories and how they're mapped. The Somali territories are mapped out and labeled as a persecution state by ILGA. The people in the communities are constructed as homophobic and backwards. However, no historical context is given with regard to the laws in the Somali Penal Code. According to ILGA, and this is a quote on page 101 of the report, we can no longer blame bad laws on colonialism alone. However, without historical context, the laws in the Somali Penal Code are considered devoid of colonial influence, and thus homophobia is constructed as inherently part of Somali culture. Obviously, I'm not arguing that there's no discrimination against people engaging in same-sex sexual activities within the Somali territories. discrimination based on sexuality is a global phenomenon. What I'm interested in, and what I'm looking at is power and global power dynamics and what is lost when historical context is removed, neglected, erased, marginalized, and dismissed, and who gains from that erasure. When historical context is neglected and erased in examinations of former colonies, all issues within the communities are blamed on the people and their innate character rather than systems of power that are responsible for or have influenced these issues. Blame and casting people of the former colonies as regressive is essential to development initiatives and the construction of the enlightened gay international and homonationalism broadly. So, although deconstruction and unpacking ILGA's work is significant to understanding power dynamics and the colonial legacy ingrained within the development work, it is important to move beyond interrupting discourses. It's important to move beyond interrupting hegemonic discourses to explore indigenous and local knowledges on sexuality that are left out of dominant discourse. To merely deconstruct ILGA's work keeps us entangled in dominant discourses and, as a result, prevents us from embracing epistemologies outside Western hegemony. So this paper is still very much a work in progress for me, and in this last section, I would like to move from the deconstruction of ILGA to a discussion on sexualities and epistemologies outside ILGA's understanding of sexualities. Sarah Barak argues that we must generate our own language and speech from other points of departure to move beyond hegemonic epistemologies on sexualities. Many groups around the world have their own language and understanding of sexualities and that cannot be understood within the work of ILGA, that cannot be understood within that map. In this paper, I hope to take postcolonial theory beyond deconstruction to explore the multi-dimensions of sexuality. Because we all know men having sex with men and women having sex with women is not newly invented. It's not a newly invented practice, nor was it founded in the West. Sexuality and gender are multidimensional. However, this understanding of sexuality, like I said, is not palatable to ILGA. The classification and labeling of same-sex sexual practices as lesbian and gay forces people to turn their sexuality into an identity category. These categories may not exist in other language. As Wat Thiong'o states, a language carries and sustains a people's worldview. Thus, lesbian and gay are not merely words, but rather identity categories that have a history within the English language and carries with it connotations and contexts that are not universal to all cultures, language, and history. And I think one of the best texts I read that really demonstrated that was Gloria Wecker's The Politics of Passion. Gloria Wecker is an Afro-Surinamese woman that grew up in the diaspora, and she goes back to her home country of Suriname and examines the sexuality of Afro-Surinamese women. And the women she talks to, the women all discuss their sexuality as a verb rather than a noun. They call it mati work. Mati work is an action rather than an identity. Mati work is practiced by women who have sex with men and women either simultaneously or consecutively. She avoids comparing these women's sexualities to Western understandings of sexuality by keeping away from signifiers such as lesbian, homosexuality, and heterosexuality because of their Euro-American situatedness and their unwanted baggage. Mati work does not reinforce the homosexuals / heterosexual binary, and nor does it fit into the identity categories of lesbian and gay. And as a result, the gay imperialist projects cast out Mati work and constructs these women as repressed, oppressed, and degressive. The intricacies of gender, sexual practices, and sexuality cannot be understood through ILGA's mapping of the world. Within the Somali language, men who have sex with men are called khanis, and women who have sex with women are considered khanisat. These words do not necessarily reflect the identity categories of lesbian and gay, because as I said, they don't have the same history as the Western ways of knowing sexuality. Attempting to classify Western identity categories erases the history and meaning of these words. As previously stated, words carry history, culture, and connotation that cannot always be translatable. And although Khanis and Khanisid are currently used in the Somali language, these words originally derive from Arabic. They are not actually Somali words, and a lot of the language around sexuality are not Somali words. They come from Arabic. So part of why I bring this up is that part of the work that I'm interested in looking at is the different ways in which same-sex sexual practices are discussed in Somali language, and right now I'm interested in looking at stories and folklore on sexuality that predates Islam, that predates any sort of Arab influence, and I'm going to use the word Arab supremacy as well. I want to explore this further and look at the ways in which sexuality has been discussed in Somali cultures and within our communities. And I've been doing this so far by looking at I've been entering a lot of Somali chat rooms lately to see how these sorts of discussions are being had, and unfortunately it's not at all as critical. I've read a lot of people saying, oh, the Somali language has no way of talking about same-sex sexual practices because we never did that until the Arabs came. And that's extremely problematic because men have been having sex with men and women have been having sex with women since the beginning of time. The Arabs didn't bring that, white people didn't bring that, we've always had that. So let's get that straight to begin with. And so what I'm interested is taking that further to really look at the language. And acts of same-sex sexuality that can't be just put into words, cannot be put into categories, is completely unfathomable to ILGA and to Western imperialism, period, because Western colonization and imperialism relies on categorizing, labeling, carving out regions, people, and cultures as part of a mechanism of control. And so I'm interested in moving beyond ILGA, homo-nationalism, gay imperialism, hegemonic epistemologies, and discourses on sexuality to center our stories, our language, and our context.
We're running short on time. I want to thank our panelists for a really invigorating conversation. And they've touched on really different but yet similar themes, and the way that these themes are practiced and engaged with both in the Horn and in the diaspora. I really just want to move straight into the question and answer period. If you keep your questions really brief, and I'm going to repeat them for the live stream. How much time do we have?
So we actually don't have time. Let's do 2 comment questions, and then if you guys want to discuss things with people during the lunch break, you're welcome.
All right, okay.
2.
Great, so let's try and bring them together and make them really deep, because we've only got 2. So.
Okay, I'll go first, and before I actually forget the question, I noticed you looked at the penal code and how it's constituted historically from the Indian whatever was there. But I wonder why it remained there, and you didn't look at the other side where the Christian fundamentalists from the United States is actually pumping a lot of money to enforce these codes. Mm-hmm. So that, I think I was wondering, is that an oversight, or what? Why? Because they have a lot to do with why governments in East Africa are actually now criminalizing even further in the sense of like Uganda and other places. And this is a part of, because there's been a huge rise of churches and, parallel to Islam and that whatever they call fundamentalism, there's also Christian fundamentalism that's going on. So that's also the other part. So I'm wondering that side of it. The people who the ELGA are fighting in that sense, what about them?
So Abdul Latif, sorry, just really for the live stream, Abdul Latif Ige was asked to just the way that you looked at the penal codes and looked at the interventions that are now coming in from other Western states, and how they're translating not just the way that these penal codes are enforced, but how other modes of thinking and belief systems are also.
Not particularly that, but I'm trying to say that even the African governments are, so the people who are resurrecting these penal codes are actually the Christian fundamentalists who are engaged in trying to, transport their religious ideas of, that. So I'm trying to say that there are two actors here. What about this guy? Because what is absent here is the African, in that sense.
I actually do talk about that, but not because this presentation was so short. I didn't bring it into this paper, but part of this stuff, work on gay imperialism, colonialism, is part of also my own activism. And one of the things I have done is I don't do it as much as I used to, but I used to do an African radio show where I specifically interview sexually variant and gender variant organizations throughout the continent. And I as well have worked with different ones when I was living in Kenya as well. And we saw that firsthand. We saw these LGBT organizations from the West coming in and trying to give us money to do things their way and tell us what it is to be gay, and you're not gay enough. And so, in terms of the Christian fundamentalist part, I do a lot of work on that in terms of my radio. But for this paper and the lack of time, one of my big problems was bringing this paper into a 15-minute, which I really took 20 minutes conversation. But Christian fundamental organizations have played a huge role in funding laws that are considered problematic laws, specifically in Uganda. You have you've got evangelical churches sponsoring these laws that specifically persecute LGBT and sexually variant and gender variant people. And so I didn't bring it up in this context, but I do bring it up in a lot of my podcasts. So if I can always bring that to you if you would like. And it's really, I focused on ILGA in this work, but ILGA is part of this. And part of the reason why I go into what makes up ILGA and who the gay internationalism and how homonationalism works is that ILGA, and in order for the gay subject to be included in the national imaginary, they need Somalia to be homophobic. They need the Somali territories. They need black people to be seen as homophobic, and so on. They need us to be othered in that way in order to propagate themselves into this old boys club.
Another question? Anybody from the gallery? We see you. All right. Do you want to stand up?
Okay. So my question was on the first generation. So for Odin, I had a question regarding you broke down between, I guess, older women activism and young women activism, and loudness. So a silent versus a loud. And I wanted to know if there was any contestation or ambivalence between those two forms of activism and how they might get read, especially if we take into consideration blackness and the way in which that's ambivalent in these types of communities, right? So I wanted you to speak more on that and how, that binary is not as clean as you might think. So I wanted you to speak more on that.
So the quiet activism really came up with the younger generation. So many of them wanted to really make a point that their activism, being loud, being on the forefront of whether it's Black Lives Matter or whether it's issues challenging Somali culture, the normative gender discourse within our communities, the way that we silence and shame victims of sexual violence. They wanted really, to them, is that their loudness is a necessity. It's a life source for them. And they hope to, and in their perspective, they said that hopefully in my children's generation, we don't have to be as loud. They don't have to be as loud as we are, right? So they hope to have an activism that is a little bit more settled. That a younger generation, the fourth or the fifth generation of Somali women or Somali young boys don't have to fight through the system. They don't have to battle the same issues all over again within their own communities. So it wasn't so much that they felt the quiet activism was a negative thing. It's just more how culturally a lot of their lived experiences is very much different than their lived experiences of the Somali parents. So our parents lived in Somalia. They have a completely different history, a different reality, a different perspective, and they carry a layers of a lot of what it means to be a Somali woman, what it means to be a Muslim woman. And they wanted to diverge from that because they felt that it was necessary for them to address crucial issues within their own communities and systematic issues that is within white supremacy within Canadian society. So it's messy, but it's fun to have a messy discourse and to messy activism. And they just wanted to disrupt the normative discourses and to have a different outlook and a different dialogue than what it is to be a Somali Muslim woman.
Wonderful.
We're gonna break for lunch. How much time do we have?
So let's make